Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of lectures delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, author of classic books such as The Rule of Three. This lecture is a must for prospective entrepreneurs and is titled The 16 Immutable Laws of Entrepreneurship. I hope you enjoy Professor Sheth's informal, conversational style, corroborated by real-world examples.
This is one of my favorite topics. Is there a regularity or a set of laws about successful entrepreneurship? The title of this lecture is The 16 Immutable Laws of Entrepreneurship. Quite often we believe that entrepreneurship is by luck, it is by opportunistic behavior, but I began to archive, analyze the histories of past failures and success and have come to conclusion that there is some degree of predictability that we can therefore improve the odds of succeeding through entrepreneurship. So let me start the lecture by basically saying we are all amazed at the success of great entrepreneurs such as Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and Thomas Watson. Now remember, Thomas Watson is the founder of IBM. Before that one, we had actually Alexander Graham Bell, who started the Bell system, a great inventor but became an entrepreneur. And if you look at the history of this one, there have been amazing entrepreneurs in the agricultural age, in the industrial age, in the services economy age, and of course now in the technology age, especially in the internet age. So what makes great entrepreneurs, which has been a typical question? Are entrepreneurs born or they are made, just like our salespeople born or made is a typical argument we raise, especially in the academic circles. Is it just being lucky? In fact, when you talk to many entrepreneurs, they will say, I was just lucky. Or they are being opportunistic. One of the key characteristics of entrepreneurship is all about opportunistic behavior. There is a great movie, by the way, which I really love to watch again and again. It's a British movie called Being There, and Peter Sellers is the actor who was a typical, very interesting character player. And this is a movie about Chauncey the gardener, who is an illiterate person, cutting the hedges and mumbling to himself, but somehow people believe that he's saying wise things, so he becomes a wise man. So it's just being there, which also is somewhat true, but at the same time, are there certain immutable laws of entrepreneurship, as we have seen in art, as we have seen in writing, for example, as we have seen in sculpting, as we have seen, in fact, in painting, anything, that there are certain laws with which one can organize and succeed better than just by chance. So are there certain immutable laws of entrepreneurship that we can distill from past successes and probably more importantly from past failures? So I like to do the early history of great enterprises. We'd say it's a Daimler-Benz, or we'd say Hewlett-Packard, whether it's a Microsoft, whether it's Rockefellers, whether it's Sears Roebuck, does not make any difference. Across industries, you see a pattern with which these great entrepreneurs organized an industry or organized a company within an industry with great success. But you have also seen lots of failures. So can you analyze the failures of many of the startup companies and understand what did they do wrong versus the successful companies, what they did right, and come out with certain regularities or law-like generalizations, and hence it's called the 16 Immutable Laws of Entrepreneurship. The first major law of entrepreneurship is, as everybody says, business success is only 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. You cannot go to heaven without dying, as the saying goes, which means ideas may be out there plenty, but it is the organization and execution of those ideas that makes great successful entrepreneurs. And those who fail are strictly idea people. They may have even inventions and patents, but they don't have the competency to organize, or they don't have the hard work that is necessary to succeed as entrepreneurs. So 99% perspiration says it is just sheer hard work. And that's more important to focus on than just the idea. Second law, the best inspirations come from frustrated or unhappy users of existing alternatives. In other words, something in the current area of consumption or production, something is not working well. There is friction, as it is called nowadays, and therefore as a user of the product or the service, you are very unhappy and you think there has to be a better way, and therefore you begin to become innovative, you begin to become inventive, and that is how you organize a business. The most recent example is a young lady in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live, created actually using spandex, a company which is basically a combination of a pantyhose and a typical girdle by and large. And it became an instant success. She became a billionaire in less than 10 years. But again, in her autobiography and in her video comments that she has made, she really did not know how to organize, but she had this drive and persistence, and she eventually got good advice and input from companies. She even got a good supplier to line up to make those things for her, and the rest is history. So the best inspirations come from frustrated or unhappy users, and therefore users are more entrepreneurs than suppliers, which is an interesting way of looking at the world. The third and my own observation is that entrepreneurship is a marathon race and not a 100-meter dash. We think I can get it done sooner. In fact, all the Silicon Valley venture capital guys I have found, it doesn't happen as soon as they think. In fact, costs happen sooner, revenues always happen later. Interestingly, right? No matter what the business plan is. If you are having this typical spreadsheet and saying, I expect my revenues in the next 6 months or 9 months, they always get delayed and the cost comes sooner, and therefore your biggest problem is cash flow. And most entrepreneurs die because they run out of cash. Not because there is no market, there is no good idea, but they simply don't have money anymore to continue the journey. And if you borrow the venture capitalist money, what happens? In the second round, they dilute you out, and therefore you created a business, you put your time, and you lost everything. So like a marathon race, what you need is a slow burning carbohydrates or pasta. So all athletes before the race actually eat a lot of pasta because it gives you a long energy. They don't eat sugar as much, or chocolates, for example, which gives you instant energy but lasts for a short time. And the pasta for business is cash. So I always look at the burn rate, as it is called, or the cash flow. And as soon as you see the danger signs of a cash flow, you know that the company and the entrepreneur will be in trouble. It's very predictable, by the way, surprisingly predictable. And in fact, in the dot-com boom of the late 90s and the dot-com bust of 2001, if you analyze most of the failures, it's not because they didn't have a good idea using the internet and the typical, technology, but because they just ran out of cash. And they got diluted. Either they had to shut down the business, good people left them, or the venture capitalists took control of the company and basically allocated more resources and have new leadership in place by and large. And I've been on the boards of several of them where I have seen this huge problem with cash flow management. Fourth, most successful companies that we know today as great enterprises started always in a garage or a basement. It's a truism, surprisingly. So there, it's obvious. They do not start in a lavish office with expensive infrastructure, overheads as we call it. And by the way, in the dot-com boom, that's what I found. People were building or renting enormously luxurious offices, not watching their burn rate and outspending before the revenue show up. So best examples of these kinds of garage-oriented companies are, as I mentioned earlier, Hewlett-Packard, for example. FedEx began the same way. Fred Smith, who was the entrepreneur organizer of the company, which is world-class, borrowed money from family and friends in order to create a scale in what they called overnight delivery business by and large, to succeed against an incumbent U.S. Postal Service and to succeed against another incumbent called United Parcel Service or UPS. Walt Disney, if you look at the history of Walt Disney himself, the same way. Very passionate about cartoons and the movies and all this stuff, but struggled enormously in the early days, and then he became successful. And again, starting in a more humble way than in a more ambitious, lavish way. And same thing is true of the more recent success, such as the Facebook, which is a remarkable story, starting as an undergraduate student, creating the Facebook for the social networking of students at Harvard, getting other university students to join, began in a very simple way in many ways. Of course, not in the garage or in the basement, but in a dormitory room. In this case, makes no difference. It's the same message essentially. And Facebook and similarly more recent examples, it shows you the same history. Point number 5, law number 5. Most successful companies, startup companies, are made by one or two customers and not by the size of the market. I have reviewed hundreds of new business plans, new ventures, especially in the internet and the, let's say, the application age today on platforms like the Android, Google, etc. And I always absolutely chuckle. Nowadays I smile or break out in laughter when I see size of the market is billions of dollars. If we can only get 1/10 of 1%, we will have hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, and we will capture that revenue. It's all bunk. If you analyze all successful and struggling companies that survived, they were basically made by one account or one customer, or in many ways the customer discovered them. They did not even discover the customer. My best example, and where I learned this law, is at Whirlpool Corporation, a company that is the largest in appliance making. Upton Machine Company. Upton family actually created automatic washer similar to Maytag, another company, struggling very hard how to sell it. Actually got Sears as a customer. Sears discovered them, invested in them, nurtured them, because Sears thought automatic washer will give them a unique advantage on their brand called Kenmore. And by the way, Upton Machine Company made private label Kenmore, a store brand, pretty much a Sears brand, and the rest is history. Then they were allowed by Sears to start their own brand called Whirlpool, which will be distributed through other outlets than Sears. And Sears thought that it will give economies of scale in procurement and production. Open books, by the way. It's a great company, and I really loved being an advisor to the company for about a decade almost. And so I learned from them, and then I began to observe that all successful companies ultimately are made by one or no more than two customers. Another great story is about Daimler-Benz. Carl Benz is the founder of modern automobile, as we know, a German. Daimler was another one. Daimler brand was famous in racing cars. This is the turn of the last century, 1900s. And both were basically absolutely struggling. Government put them together in some fashion, and the customer they discovered surprisingly was a Russian Jew who, during the revolution against the Tsars, the communist revolution of 1917-18, there was a World War I happening at the same time, fled Russia, came to France, and he had brought his cash, and he made the offer, 34 cars I will buy. Remember, in those days you made one car at a time in a garage, just like we build one home at a time now. There was no mass production. There was no Henry Ford, Model T, all that came much later. So he began to say, I will buy 34 cars with one condition. I cannot use Daimler name to sell these cars outside of Germany in Europe, such as in France, Italy, United Kingdom, because Daimler as a name is hated by people because it's synonymous with a German name. So I would like to call it Mercedes. Where did the Mercedes name come from? It is the customer's daughter's name. Isn't that interesting? Daimler-Benz got a second break in their life. Great car, very durable, very sturdy. In those days, if you could own a car, you could have a chauffeur. Mostly chauffeur-driven cars for wealthy families. Just like if you have horses and buggies, you had a horse rider, the carriage rider, and you sat in the back. So you never drove the horse and buggy yourself unless the carriage driver was not available. Same phenomenon. It's a horseless buggy, essentially. So you had a driver. There was a head-on collision in Germany. Other car got demolished. Probably the passenger and the driver died, and out of the Daimler car, a person walked out unscathed, and that was Adolf Hitler, and immediately blessed Daimler-Benz as the automobile for the state enterprise, including the military, which is why Daimler went into the diesel engine and went into making actually, the commercial vehicles, not just automobiles. Microsoft. More recent story. It's repeated again and again. Every decade you find another story like that. Microsoft really got its break by one customer identifying Microsoft, namely IBM, as they did identification of Intel, the chip maker, which I will talk about a little later on. So, sixth law. Most successful companies actually die once or twice before they get reborn and re-energized. So just because you die doesn't mean there is no life after death. You just need that persistence, and you can create the business again. And the best recent example is Intel. Intel really began as a chip maker for low-end semiconductors, like a 8-bit processor, for video games, a consumer market. Semiconductors were mostly made by IBM for enterprise market, but they never sold it in the merchant market, as it is called. They always used their own semiconductors for their own facilities, backward integration. And therefore, Intel came to serve companies like Atari, Intellivision. They all died in the first phase of the video games revolution that began. And Intel, therefore, was basically a bankrupt company. So when IBM decided to go into the PC business, their own semiconductors meant for the mainframe computers were just too expensive, probably too powerful. So they wanted to find something that is less powerful, less expensive, and bought the Intel chips from 8-bit, 16 bits, 32 bits, and now most of the video games are 64 bits. But it was really IBM as a customer who discovered them. Krispy Kreme the same way, a franchise-related donut company. Great recipe, but it failed after a very rapid growth, for example, and has come back again. So I have examples after examples that most successful companies and even industries die. In fact, there is no first mover advantage, as I will talk about, but you have to have the persistence and survival instinct to come about. By the way, this happened to a company called MCI that wanted to compete against AT&T, and they created point-to-point towers between Chicago and St. Louis to offer data services to large enterprises who had connectivity or need between St. Louis and Chicago, and they died several times. They were built out by IBM at one time, etc. They survived. Of course, eventually, MCI was bought out by one of the baby bells called Verizon. Bell Atlantic became Verizon. They're a part of that entity now. But it's very interesting to follow the early histories of companies like MCI. Rule number 7, law number 7. Great innovators are usually poor entrepreneurs. They are really great inventors are usually poor entrepreneurs. Not innovators, but inventors. And great entrepreneurs are usually poor managers, which is interesting. It's a very predictable law of entrepreneurship. Most inventors are unable to become entrepreneurs. The recent success of the Silicon Valleys is the following. The great inventor, the companies will invest and make sure that the inventor, the founder, becomes the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, but not the CEO. Then they bring in outside talent professionally to manage it. So look at Microsoft. Really, the person who ran the company was Bill Palmer. I think it's Palmer, right? The last name. He really ran the company, not Bill Gates, essentially. Okay, very interestingly. And I've seen this pattern in many companies, all the startup companies you see recently. So it's very important because entrepreneurs have a different skill set, inventors have a different skill set, and the two don't overlap. Now, there are always some entrepreneurs who become successful. Some inventors who become successful entrepreneurs. Most entrepreneurs actually discover the inventor and know inventor is failing and actually organize a business for them. MCI that I mentioned was like that. The inventor was not doing well, and McGowan was the name, in fact, of the person who came in from outside, took hold of the company, basically pushed out even the inventor and organized into a large enterprise. It's very predictable. And my last comment is the entrepreneurs are not necessarily good organizers, good managers. They don't know the HR policy. In fact, they are in their own world and they cannot scale up quite often. It's called the founder's mentality or a founder's problem, essentially. And therefore, they are poor managers, which is another issue. There are always exceptions to what I'm saying. Okay, this is not 100% mechanics or physics or logic. But it does not mean that there is no law or a law-like generalization. 90% of the times, a good inventor is unable to become a good entrepreneur. A good entrepreneur is unable to become a good manager. And therefore, we need to focus upon what is more reality, what is more prevalent than what's an exception. And my joke is that the worst managers are usually consultants and advisors like me. We can give you the idea, but don't ask us to do it. We are poor at execution, we are good at advice. That's just a joke, and there are some exceptions, but there is a real meaning behind that joke. It's actually true more so than not. 8th law. If you treat the business as your monthly employment check, most likely you will not succeed. This is what I saw during the dot-com boom. A good person says, all right, I have to now get compensation for my monthly livelihood, especially a consultant who wanted to become an entrepreneur because he or she was used to a livelihood in a large consultancy firm, an IT consultancy firm. But he wanted to make money at the same time as a wealth creator. The two don't mix very well. Professional managers versus entrepreneurs, the compensation has to be totally differently organized. I must tell you that this is where I really find in India a better model. The entrepreneurs are called promoters, and promoters always have a professional CEO. I've seen that in Wipro, seen that at Infosys. I've seen that at many of the IT services companies in India. I've seen that in automobile industry. I've seen at Tata Group, Birla Group. Entrepreneurs do not do professional management of the organization or businesses. They are basically diversified conglomerate who have more finance control than any other control, sometimes HR policy. Interestingly, Tata Group is organized like that. So you hire professional people. So if you treat your business as your monthly livelihood, you are not likely to succeed. Remember that thing we talked about, pasta? Very important. You are in a marathon race, and if you are the biggest cause of your highest burn rate, you're going to fail. So most likely you are not likely to succeed if you want a monthly compensation. Often it is therefore not good to be both an owner and an employee. You got to make up your mind, which is a key debate quite often and a dilemma a great entrepreneur goes through. Law number 9. Stock options are bad currency. I've concluded myself. Despite what we just saw, WhatsApp that was just, I will be bought by, Facebook at $17-18 billion ungodly price. Facebook itself, and therefore, the other ones like a LinkedIn and other social media, and every employee gets a stock option. So the secretaries, for example, in fact the young people, they all get a stock option. They're all millionaires on a piece of paper. But it corrupts the system. That's the point I'm trying to make. It is as corrupt as a young analyst with economics major undergraduate degree in America becoming an analyst in a hedge fund and would now to earn $200,000-$300,000 through bonus. It's the same problem. You become primarily money driven, get rich quick kind of a notion. And therefore, in the long run, you don't remain their loyalty to the corporation. They want to start their own business now with that wealth, so they cash out. So what I like is actually it's better to give them shares, grant them shares, not stock options, at a heavily discounted price before you go public, or what is called the IPO, initial public offering, or before you sell to some other company. Because now the employee has to put some money into the corporation, not just stock options. And I saw this at Sprint Corporation. Bill Esri was the chairman. He came from the investment community. This was one of those independent telephone companies called United Telecom. They bought a long distance company from a railway, Southern Pacific Railway Information Technology, which is how the word Sprint came out as an acronym. He wanted to go into long distance business. They bought through the cash flow of the local exchange revenues. Company name changed to Sprint. Esri became the outside chairman, but he was a financially oriented person, and what he did was when he offered the company for sale, and there were two bidders, every senior executive in the company had stock options. It's called a change of control, that if the company is having a change of control, who owns it, then all of those stock options are eligible. All of them, which are typical ordinary telephone guys, just they're happy with a salary and a bonus and a good retirement, suddenly became millionaires. And guess what happened? Among the top 20 or so senior executives, as many as 15 left the company. Because I said, I don't need to work anymore for anybody, especially this company. So you hollow the corporation by stock options. So I'm opposed to stock options, but very much in favor of giving them grant money, so their money is stuck in the company, and therefore they have more stickiness in the process, rather than exit as soon as the deal is done. Law number 10. We always talk about the first mover advantage, and there's a lot of positive history about that. I find that the first mover advantage only happens if the second mover is not allowed to come in the industry. So how do you do the gatekeeping? There are only two ways you can keep a gatekeeping, in my view. One, you have strong patent rights, which is what pharmaceutical industry uses all the time, so that you have a monopoly power by law through patent rights for, let's say, 17 years, and you can renew for additional 17 years or whatever the new law now says. before you become a generic drug, and you believe that you have discovered something through chemistry that will be a blockbuster drug, such as, for example, one for cholesterol or one for, let's say, like a Viagra type, whatever they are, interestingly. So you basically are having many failures, which you cannot go through clinical trials and certify as a prescription drug, but one that succeeds now gets a monopoly power and nobody's allowed to duplicate that except the generic guys in India or China. And now government is taking a stand whether they should be allowed, should we buy their generics or not, as a major debate to shape their patent laws compatible with our patent laws to allow this monopoly, as it happens in many cases. For example, governments may give you a license to use its spectrum for television or for radio, and therefore, or telephone, as we have said, and therefore you have a monopoly given by law, essentially. The other way around is primarily to have a de facto standard, which means you decide laws are not your protection, but licensing is your way out. So you license the world. In that case, you become what is called a de facto standard. Then you have the first mover advantage. As Hughes Corporation did with DirecTV, they allowed every manufacturer in consumer electronics to make the gear, which is a small aperture satellite, VSAT technology, and they can sell it in any consumer electronics retailer. They have the retail expertise. They have the obviously, the manufacturing expertise. So companies like Thomson Electronics or Panasonic, which is Matsushita Corporation, they allowed them worldwide distribution rights. Surprisingly, that's what happened with IBM in the PC business. IBM literally created, through licensing, a de facto OS standard so that the operating system is all IBM based, what we call a PC compatible. And IBM still makes money as a royalty, even though they are no longer makers of PC. They sold their PC business to Lenovo, a Chinese company. That's very important. I'll give you the other side where the first movers have become the casualty, and there's a large literature on this one, both in the industry as well as the academic literature. The first movers become casualties in most industries, and great archival anecdotes. BlackBerry is the more recent one. Smartphones, they started the smartphones, but today BlackBerry is not able to sustain itself. It is the second movers like Google with Android and Samsung, or a Nokia that came in at one time, have taken the market away. Nokia itself was great for the basic voice phones, became number one, surpassed Motorola, which is the pioneer of cell phones as we know today. They die, interestingly. Nokia comes in. Nokia now is on its way down because they could not move into smartphones fast enough. And you see Apple on the one hand and Samsung on the Android platform becoming the dominant players. If you think it's all about technology, where it happens sooner, faster, etc., no, it happens everywhere. So Webvan was home delivery of groceries, created by a world-class ex-CEO of Accenture. He became the CEO. Investors put a lot of money. I think they invested all the way to $1 billion at one time. That home delivery, online ordering will happen. It just did not happen, interestingly. So while Amazon succeeds, you have a Webvan that fails. So we need to understand why that happens. And as I mentioned earlier in the video games, all of the American manufacturers died. They never made money, but in the second round of that industry, the Japanese made money. With a company like Sega, you might remember definitely Sony, and you might remember a company which is making Wii as a product now, for example. Very interestingly, and there are still survivors. Sega is gone essentially, which is interesting. So I think there is a whole second way you make money. First way are great pioneers, but they don't make money. Law number 11. Creating value for customers is everything. So ultimately, it's not technology, but it is value for your customers, whoever are your customers. I don't believe customers are the end users always. Customers are primarily your immediate customers. So if you're a grocery manufacturer and you have some new recipe or new packaging, don't think of the end consumers alone. Think about, in fact, the immediate buyer, which would be a retail chain. So think about them. So it's very important that you offer a good product, a better product at a lower price, in a friendly manner, easy to do business. Customers will discover you. You will always have a dominant market share. I call this as marketing 101. It's not rocket science. It's a question of executing those three things together. Better product at a lower price, not better product at premium price. Better product at a lower price, but also offered in a way that customer wants to do business with you, not the way you want to dictate and demand the business on them. And I can give you all kinds of stories where the product was very good, but the price was too high. We are watching Apple right now, both on the iPad as well as on iPhone. I think Apple's domination will decline because they are not price affordable. Great product, but it's too expensive. Starbucks in coffee, the same thing. So you see McDonald's coffee. In fact, you see Dunkin' Donut coffee. You see in my region a gas station called QT, I think, Quick Trip or something like that. People love their coffee. And it is about 3 times cheaper than Starbucks. Okay, so you can be a niche player with premium prices and a superior product, but you want to be a volume-driven mainstream player, you have to have a better product at a lower price. And by the way, that's what happened with the Japanese cars. Japanese cars were better product, more reliable, Toyota especially. Prices were very competitive, actually quite attractive. So Honda, Toyota, actually they got the dealership of General Motors. A typical Pontiac dealer began to carry Honda. A typical, I think, a Buick dealer began to carry Toyota, and the rest is history. They became the dominant brand because they were dealer friendly, whereas GM, Ford, and even Chrysler began to dictate to the dealers how they will obey the compliance of the corporation. And dealers hated them, mainly because dealers are primarily owner-managed businesses. They're entrepreneurs, they're family-run businesses. They don't like to be told by bureaucrats what to do, interestingly. And by the way, same thing has happened with a Korean car called Hyundai. Used to be a laughing stock only about 10 years ago in America. Failed miserably till they got serious about putting quality process in their car, better design in their car, keep it still affordable, offer a good dealer support network, and Hyundai has become a well-known car. Point number 12, 12th immutable law. Invest your capital, whatever capital you get from wherever you get, your own money, your friends and family helping you out, or a venture capital, but invest that capital in creating assets. Tangible assets, intangible assets, which have a resale value. So that if you have to close down the business, you don't lose everything. In fact, you might make money, as we have seen recently with the enormous price paid for Motorola cell phone business, which is dying, but it has intellectual property rights, so somebody bought them. As we have seen with Nokia cell phones recently, as we are likely to see with absolutely the RIM corporation and the BlackBerry. The value is in intellectual property rights or patent rights. So intellectual property rights, which is broader than patents, can be created by brand name that you have, which has an intangible value, a trademark you have, which has an intangible value, independent of the product or the technology, or it could be anchored to technology. The other one creating tangible assets is often land and the real estate. I don't know whether you know, and I was surprised 25 years ago when I started working in the fast food franchise business, that the largest real estate company in America was McDonald's, because they always identified next location, a typical growing suburb or a smaller town. They would get all the favorite, right to operate there, essentially. The community will actually give them pretty cheap land prices, and they will lease it out to the franchisee. They made money as landlord also, not just the royalty on selling burgers. But in the restructuring of the American economy in the late 80s, they decided to divest that whole portfolio from their balance sheet to either an independent company or sold it to somebody. I don't know what they did. So they had a land value and a building value, which had appreciated enormously over time because a successful franchisee is able to pay higher rent. So as a landlord, you make money just like renting an apartment in one way. I have seen this especially in India recently. Many of the Indian IT services companies built beautiful, very contemporary corporate campuses. 10, 12 gates to enter, 20, 30,000 employees working. And the land they got at so low price suddenly has appreciated in value. Sometimes the value of the land and the buildings of these companies is as big as the value of the revenue they derive from their services, any multiple. And usually in IT services, a typical multiple is $1 of value for about $1 of revenue. So their tangible assets are larger. My first experience about this one was not really with a startup company, but with NTT in Japan, a telephone company. Because they began many, many years ago, they had all of the downtown locations for Tokyo or Osaka, big industrial cities. And those land prices were basically nothing because they were given by the government probably. And the valuation was enormous today as a central location. Just like Baby Bells in America, just like any telephone company in Germany or France, they have an enormous tangible assets, which all of them, as you know, have divested with deregulation, privatization, and competition just to survive even. So tangible assets is another one. And the third one is that you might have created some expertise or capability, and people therefore want to pay for that capability. It could be a know-how which may be written down, a process, and people pay for that, or it could be your people. Your people themselves are talented, and therefore a company buys you while you are failing to acquire the talent. It just happened in our own family business where a special effects studio, large company, has just dissolved in India, the facility. All the talent is up for grabs and little company is buying them out essentially right now. So invest in capital which has a resale value. Law number 13. Spend no more than 15% of your revenue on sales, marketing, and branding. We overspend. And I tell you, the best example I've seen about overspending in the dot-com era, startup companies, in order to create brand awareness, is paying in those days $1.5–2 million for a 30-second spot in the Super Bowl game. It's absolutely mind-boggling insanity. First of all, I was amazed a venture capitalist sitting on the board will allow that even to a management. It's very much like betting at the racehorse with the same odds as winning a lottery. And as you know, a couple of companies that did that thing with clever advertising died. Especially the timing was poor, like in the fourth quarter. And I remember giving press interviews about their strategy, and I said it's the dumbest thing they will do because there is no value of spending that money. It's very speculative, and you cannot be speculative as a startup company. And also I find that there is no scale economy in sales and marketing, nor there is an asset value, except maybe I may concede you might have a very unique brand name, which may have a value. I concede that part, but usually it's so small and you are struggling to survive, so you will be willing to sell at foreclosure prices. Point number 14, spend no more than 10% of the non-revenue generating management. Don't spend more than that. Overheads will kill you. So you have to be very frugal. Not in innovation, which is what we talk about, frugal innovation, or jugaad in India they call it, but it's a frugal way of doing business. And this is where many Indian companies, especially in IT services, but I think it's true in industrial products like making tractors, making agricultural products, industrial products, anything. Indian management seems to have learned that the overheads is a bigger killer in margin erosion than anything, and you can't make it up in volume. So they're very frugal in their whole management investment, from salary to bonuses to office spaces to whatever they do, because there is no scale economy in management, nor is there any asset value in overheads, for example. Now there may be some if you spin out as a shared service, but that's a part of capability that I talked about early. Number 15 law. Entrepreneurship, in my view, is a solo practice, just like painting. I've not seen any painter where two painters have painted together and two signatures. Just like authors, great authors are solo authors. They're creative, but it's not like two authors writing together. It's only in the academic world with research papers where we have co-authors. Some of the best books written, which are well respected worldwide, are solo authors. Adam Smith in Capitalism, David Ricardo in Trade Theory. I can go on giving examples in any discipline. So entrepreneurship is very similar. It's solo practice, not a group practice, because often a group practice becomes group meditation, becomes totally an impasse. If you have a bunch of great entrepreneurs, they're all on a jockey for their own position. Entrepreneurs are drivers, and therefore you have to either create space and specialization. You will do that, I will do that, as a way of sharing in the cheap labor as entrepreneurs, more so than anything else. But I always believe entrepreneurship is a solo practice, which is why many startup entrepreneurs as teams, like Mark Zuckerberg, or many IT companies in Silicon Valley I've seen, where all other partners are pushed out. or they'll leave. And there's one guy who ultimately becomes, I would say, almost a ruthless entrepreneur who runs the company and creates a business. So entrepreneurship is a solo practice, my view. Last and the most important law is, may the force be with you. Remember, in Star Wars, we are going into this unknown territory, and the advice given is that may the force be with you, which says no matter how you analyze it, ultimately success through entrepreneurship still requires the blessings of the context, the environment, and therefore you will need it. So why you need the force? Not maybe as much God's blessing you, being lucky, but it psychs you up. That's what happens to great athletes. That's what happens at Olympics, where the same person in the last stretch and that spirit of really winning, making a difference, psychs himself or herself up by having somebody blessing them. Whether it's a faith-based blessing or a space-based blessing like the Star Wars, makes no difference to me. It simply psychs you up to perform to your level of potential and excellence, and that's what ultimately you need in entrepreneurship. So the 16 immutable laws, let me conclude this lecture. Entrepreneurship, as you know, is the new obsession of everybody, whether you are young or old, male or female, techie or non-techie. We find this is a big fervor and a fever among our students, MBA students, undergraduate students. They all want to be entrepreneurs. They don't think like their grandparents, starting with a company as a career, moving up gradually through succession planning, basically job improvement or promotions, and retiring with a gold watch ceremony. They just don't think like that. They think like, why would I work for a company? Or if I work for a company, I will work for maybe 3-4 months just to get experience while I'm thinking about starting my own business, right? So this seems to be obsession by everybody. It is surprisingly also an obsession with governments. From most advanced countries like US, and our president and our policymakers are saying, how can we make America even more entrepreneurial for our competitive advantage? But it is also true in Singapore as I travel there, as it is true, in fact, I find in two of the largest consumer economies, which is China and India. So it is everywhere. We are dazzled with the great success of great entrepreneurial companies like Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, and LinkedIn. We all want to know what is the secret of successful entrepreneurship. So based upon the evidence of past failures and successes, I've identified what I call the 16 immutable laws of successful entrepreneurship. They range from where the new idea for a product or services originated, to how to create operational excellence, to managing the cash flow. They all range into those 3 categories. No matter what business you are in, success depends on circumstances. Context matters. And therefore, may the force be with you. You will need it.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on the 16 Immutable Laws of Entrepreneurship with Professor Jagdish Sheth. For more about Professor Sheth and the Sheth Leadership Academy, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.